Hi, this is Michael Kennedy from the University of Virginia, and this is a short recording to give you some insights around high leverage practice number 12, which is about systematically designing instruction. Many students with disabilities struggle, obviously, in a lot of ways, particularly when they're learning complex new content and the information isn't terribly or at all relevant to their life. As a result, many students with disabilities, when information is first presented to them, have a very difficult time learning that information. Teachers are under big pressure to move quickly from topic to topic because of pacing guides and assessments coming up and those kinds of reasons. And in addition, content within subject areas or within courses is additive. And so when students have deficits in certain areas or many areas, those gaps can snowball and really result in substantial frustration for the student and then failure. And so HLP number 12, systematically designing instruction, is all about figuring out how we can put a high quality plan in place to support that from not happening. This HLP goes hand in hand with HLP number 11, which is to identify long and short-term learning goals. From my perspective, when we use the HLPs from the collaboration domain, where we're working collaboratively with our colleagues, but also with family members to come up with a logical set of supports for students, then we're using the HLPs from the assessment domain, where we're using a range of data sources and communicating clearly with colleagues and families around the results of those assessments. Then it makes sense that the specific goals that rise out of those collaborations and evaluations of data make sense, but whether they're on a long or short-term basis. But then we need the specially designed instruction, the special education, that actually helps students make gains towards those goals. And that's really what HLP number 12 and many of the HLPs to come within the instruction domain of the HLPs comes into play. If you haven't already, please visit highleveragepractices.org, the website shown here, and then you can go to the Find Resources tab and the HLP leadership guides. Colleagues and I put these together to help guide you to think about critical aspects of each HLP and some key questions that you should be thinking about as you're learning about and implementing these practices. The information within this presentation has come from both those leadership guides, which are based on the book written by CEC and Routledge in a series of editors and authors. So the first part of HLP number 12 is the accomplish model, which is a mnemonic that can help you to create goals and a plan toward those goals that can be successful. And this accomplish model really goes hand in hand nicely with HLP 11 as well. So the first A stands for accomplish, the first A in accomplish stands for antecedent condition. And so teachers should be clear about exactly where and how skills and knowledge will be measured within broad settings and individualized lessons. So when I look at some sample goals here, when given a second grade reading passage within, there's the key, language arts block, students will. When given 2 sixth grade level texts about the same person or event in social studies, there it is. When given a multi-step problem in mathematics. So we're just being really deliberate about where this goal is going to take place. The first C in accomplish is about making sure that the goal has a conspicuous behavior specified. So that means the teacher should develop goals that clearly define what the student will do to demonstrate learning. So if we look at some of these samples, the student will read aloud with errors and correct pronunciations recorded and answer literal comprehension questions. Students will identify similarities and differences between different texts written about the same event or person and create and complete a Venn diagram. Students will use properties of operations to calculate and will assess the reasonableness of their answers by estimating. So in each, exactly what the student is going to do is very clearly specified, and that's what this is all about. The second C is the clear criteria. So you should know clearly the extent to which the student achieved the goal. So in these samples, read 87 words per minute with less than 5 errors and answer 8 out of 10 questions with accuracy. You see how clear that is? There's no debate about what we're talking about. After reading the text, students will compare and contrast the interpretations of an event on a Venn diagram with 85% accuracy. So this is what we're talking about. Each of these goals are well specified. They're conspicuous. They're clear. But they're also observable. We make sure that every goal is not something like the student will improve their reading. Well, that's not observable enough. We want goals to be written like these samples that we're showing here, that the student will be able to be measured in a very specific way on a very specific kind of measure, both the accuracy and or the errors counted. We want everything to be measurable. Observable, I can clearly tell that it's happening or not happening. Measurable, I can clearly tell the extent to which the student is hitting the mark. That the student read 87 words in a minute with only 3 errors and answered 8 out of 10 of the questions. You were able to compare and contrast between 2 texts on a Venn diagram with 90% accuracy. The P in accomplish stands for positive. We want to make sure the goals that we're writing are written in such a way that they reflect the positive outcome, not that the student will only make 3 errors or something like that. No, the student is going to have success, and the student will successfully answer 7 out of 10 questions. These are subtleties, right, within the way we're writing these goals, but they are important because they signal both to the teacher who's implementing them, because they're the main ones who are going to interact with these goals on a regular basis. But they also signal to the student that this is something that you can absolutely do and should do. The L in accomplish is making sure that our goals are linked to the general curriculum to the maximum extent possible. And we know how important it is to make sure that the long and short-term goals that we're developing and then the plan that we put in place to help address it gets the student as close to grade level standards as possible. The I in accomplish, of course, individualized. So special education is all about individualization. It's all about that specially designed instruction and making sure, because this is not easy and not always obvious, how we translate complex standards into specific IEP goals that are relevant for that specific student, but meaningful as well. The S in accomplish is socially valid. There's so many areas where we could potentially create goals for students. So we want to be sure that the ones that we opt to use and select make sense for students. Here's some examples when we're thinking about students. Given a variety of coins, students will identify the value of pennies, nickels, and dimes This is really important stuff. Like, this is things that kids actually need to know, given a variety of coins and bills. When rereading a passage, students will be able to reread and make predictions. These are transferable skills. Using context clues, that last one. Kids need to be able to do this. So that's how we know these goals are really socially valid. They're not about Jeopardy facts or tier 3 kind of information. And finally, they're high-reaching. So we want our goals to be realistic, absolutely, but we want there to be a reach so that students are thinking about all the possibilities and teachers are thinking about all the possibilities that students with disabilities could hold moving forward. Okay, so some questions for you to think about, regardless of your role, but think about the context of your current setting. Are the goals that you've set done with the specificity and clarity that we just went through with respect to the accomplished model? Therefore, are the goals observable, measurable? Are they linked to the most critical information? Do they address individual needs, or are they cookie cutter? Excuse me. These are tough questions to consider. And if you're sitting there listening to this saying, you know what, I just don't know, well, that's okay, but you need to. And this is a good fertile ground where a professional learning community or some other grade level team could absolutely begin to examine and evaluate the answer to this. We do want to make sure that our IEPs are in compliance, certainly, but that's not the only thing we're doing when we're creating long and short-term goals and then the systematically designed plan to address it. We want to make sure that we're teaching big ideas and main ideas before the subtle details. So when we look at a standard like this one, this is a science goal where we're constructing scientific explanations based on evidence for the role of photosynthesis in the cycling of matter and flow and of energy into and out of organisms. That sounds like a mouthful. Well, what is the IEP goal going to sound like related to this? Because we don't usually have IEP goals for science specifically, and it certainly isn't going to be about photosynthesis. So as I'm systematically designing instruction that's going to address this, I want to make sure that the student is going to be able to, within grade level text, identify correct information, answer comprehension questions with accuracy. I want to make sure that they can categorize information with accuracy. This is one of the things that's so hard for teachers, to translate standards and curriculum, which are so specific often, into IEP goals, which are broad and cut across multiple areas. That's why it's so important for us to recognize what are the main ideas, what are the big ideas, because they can help us in our work to figure out, well, wait a minute, no student's going to create a scientific explanation without knowing just what photosynthesis is, knowing what energy is, knowing what the matter cycle is. When I'm thinking about teaching kids with disabilities and systematically designing instruction, see how the nitty-gritty detail that I'm getting to out of this giant standard that's very important, but it's also very complicated. And I'm thinking about that student with a learning disability or dyslexia. I'm thinking about a student with a behavioral challenge or perhaps autism. And how can I break this down so I can help them be a success? Something to think about for your team. How can we help teachers focus on big ideas instead of, what I call Jeopardy level facts that we do get obsessed with because they're fun? They're seductive details. I'm sure it matters how many casualties there were on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. I just want to make sure that all of the students know, who won the battle and what its significance was and lasting impact on the war. That's sort of what I'm talking about here. Another key principle is to teach according to a logical hierarchy. So you're teaching less complex before more complex skills, prerequisite skills before requisites, and concrete information before abstract. And also separately teaching skills that are similar before requiring discrimination. I have an example of this here. So if I'm teaching young children and I want to get the basic shapes taught to them first before I have them recognize, oh, there is a difference between a square and a rectangle, and blow their mind by explaining to them, that a square is a rectangle. It's better for them to be able to understand the basics before I get more complicated. And the same thing is true for older kids, excuse me, as I'm teaching about animals that, okay, lion and zebra, tiger, rhino, yes, these are all mammals. But guess what? Bats and dolphins are mammals too. Whoa, wait a minute. Those are really different. I wouldn't have thought that. So teaching according to this, what we call this hierarchy, the prerequisite information, the concrete info before I get abstract, really helps kids to be successful. Another recommendation is to teach commonly encountered content before lower frequency content. I'm guessing you know who the president on the left is, and maybe I have a guess on who the one on the right is, and I found that picture and I'm not sure who it is. Another recommendation is to strategically design instruction that helps students make connections with appropriate sequencing of content and skills. And so there are 6 principles of effective instruction that I want to highlight here. One is one I've mentioned, relating new content to big ideas for that content. So if today's lesson, as an example, is on organelles, the big idea is about cells and cell processes. If I understand what a cell is and what it does, then I can start to think about, those cells are made up of specific parts that each have its own job, which is the definition of organelle. You should also incorporate strategies that are explicit and unambiguous to help students make connections to big ideas. A lot of times we use specific strategies like learning strategies that have a mnemonic that helps students to remember the specific steps of how to go through a specific problem. The Q-tips strategy for problem solving in mathematics is an example. And I also want to provide scaffolds by using the model lead test, or the I do, we do, you do sequence. This is well known to those of you familiar with explicit instruction, which is also HLP number 16, and there is a forthcoming lecture on HLP 16 in one of our videos as well. But you should definitely think about, how can I model this and show my expert thinking to students? How can I guide them through it by providing a lot of opportunities to respond that are still guided by me, and I give them a lot of feedback and then give them a chance to practice on their own. And I want to prime the students' background knowledge by guiding them to identify information they already know. I can do this through a series of review activities, Kahoot, or other kinds of question and answer sequences provided by the teacher. Excuse me. I want to be strategic as I do this with how I integrate what I've taught before with the new information that's coming up. One of the best ways I know to do that is through anchored instruction, where I'm connecting the new information to something in the real world that the student is really aware of. And there's a lot of good information that you can find out on the web about anchored instruction. But the key of it is just knowing what your students know a lot about and care about, and then figuring out a way to attach this new information to make it relevant for them. After I've made these good connections with and for students, helping them to review the information carefully so they can build on the new information using programs like Kahoot, or just pre-writing questions. Tell me, everybody, is this a chemical change or not? Boiling water, is that a chemical change? Okay, no, it's not. Good, why? How about this? Banana rotting, is that a chemical change? It sure is, why? Let's look at this multiple choice question. Tell me, which one is a chemical change? Using graphic organizers and other visual aids is also a very effective strategy for helping students to recognize and understand new information. Venn diagrams, Frere models, graphic organizers like the kind created by the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning. These are all terrific resources, low tech, but effective tech in terms of helping students to make needed connections. A key to any HLP, but certainly HLP 12, is all about monitoring data to make decisions so that I'm paying attention to how well my systematically designed instruction is working. If you're not familiar with the data-based instruction steps laid out by the National Center on Intensive Intervention, available at intensiveintervention.org. This is an OSEP-funded center sponsored by the American Institutes for Research, and I strongly recommend you check into them. This connects really nicely with HLP number 6 out of the assessment domain, but it also has its very own HLP. HLP 20 is use intensive instruction, and it connects really nicely with HLP 12, systematically designing instruction. Let's go through a few tips and tricks to wrap up this section on HLP number 12. First, you want your colleagues to have a strong repertoire of explicit and other instructional strategies needed to systematically design instruction. For example, you really want to be strong as you can, about the implementation of explicit instruction. Go on to the lecture provided around explicit instruction, or go to highleveragepractices.org and pull down the implementation sheet and the video that we have provided. This is so critical, and really you can't systematically design instruction if you're not providing explicit instruction. But also vice versa. Explicit instruction doesn't really make sense if it hasn't been systematically designed to address specific learning goals. So they really do go hand in hand. You want to make sure that you've evaluated the extent to which your colleagues have these skills and identify, well, where are our gaps? Where are we weak? Where could improvement be made? Make sure that the accomplish model for creating, implementing, and evaluating your long and short-term goals is in place. And look at those goals to make sure that they're tied to standards, but they're also SMART goals, that they're specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and they're timely. Thanks for checking out this video on HLP number 12. Again, I'm Michael Kennedy from the University of Virginia. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to visiting with you in other videos in this series. Take care.